Sean Diddy Combs faces sex trafficking charges based largely on his ex-girlfriend Cassie Ventura's explosive testimony. But at this point in the trial, have prosecutors proven it? What is sex trafficking exactly, and how does the evidence measure up so far? I'm going to speak with a former federal prosecutor on what it takes to build a case like this, and have prosecutors proven beyond a reasonable doubt right now that he's guilty of sex trafficking? Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Okay, so as the third week of testimony begins in the federal trial of Sean Diddy Combs, a string of witnesses, and by the way, even rapper Kid Cudi, who I think is a very, very important witness, they have described this world allegedly marked by chaos, intimidation, control inside of the music mogul's inner circle. But how does it apply to the federal charges? Because here's the thing, Combs is facing multiple charges, and we already broke down the main count of the case, racketeering conspiracy. We broke that down in a previous episode of Sidebar, whether or not at this point in the case the prosecution has proven racketeering. Encourage everybody to check it out. But aside from that charge, aside from the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, he is also facing 2 counts of sex trafficking. And these, by the way, are charges that carry up to life in prison and a minimum 15 years in prison if he's convicted. So to think about the stakes being any higher, they really aren't. This is what we're talking about. And one of those counts of sex trafficking is a victim 1, Combs' ex-girlfriend, Cassie Ventura. And yes, a lot of this hinges on her testimony. So with 2 weeks of emotional and often explosive testimony behind them, prosecutors have laid out a sweeping narrative of violence and manipulation. But have they proven sex trafficking? That's the question. For example, did Combs knowingly use force, fraud, or coercion to compel Cassie Ventura into commercial sex acts? So we're going to try to answer that, including what sex trafficking actually means under federal law, what prosecutors have to prove, and how the evidence presented thus far stacks up against one of the most serious allegations that Combs faces. So I think we should first start off with what sex trafficking actually is. You go to the indictment against Combs, and it alleges, when you're talking about Cassie Ventura, that from 2009 to 2018, he, quote, knowingly recruited, enticed, harbored, transported, provided, obtained, advertised, maintained, patronized, and solicited by any means a person, knowing and in reckless disregard of the fact that means of force, threats of force, fraud, and coercion, and any combination of such means would be used to cause the person to engage in a commercial sex act, and attempted, aided, and abetted, and willfully caused the same. To wit, Combs recruited, enticed, harbored, transported, and maintained victim 1, and attempted, aided, and abetted, and willfully caused victim 1 to engage in commercial sex acts, knowing and in reckless disregard of the fact that victim 1 was engaging in commercial sex acts as a result of force, fraud, and coercion. And of course, we know that victim 1 is Combs' ex-girlfriend, Cassie Ventura. Now, I'm going to try to break all of this down because it's a lot of legalese, but I'm not going to do it alone. I'm joined by a very special guest. I am joined by former federal prosecutor Nadia Shihata, who led the team that secured R. Kelly's conviction in his racketeering and federal sex crimes trial. Nadia, so good to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time to come back here on Sidebar.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Did I get it right? I mean, did I miss anything out by sex trafficking? When we talk about what sex trafficking is, in plain language, what should we be thinking about?
It's essentially, the key words are using force, fraud, or coercion to get someone to engage in commercial sex. Here, that's sex where money is exchanged. That's enough for commercial sex. It's really anything of value. Here, it's money. Real quick,
does that mean that Ventura had to have been paid or promised something of value? Or is it that the escorts, the alleged male sex workers that were hired, they're being paid, that's what makes it commercial sex?
As long as a thing of value is being exchanged, it can be either one of them. So here, it's the sex worker.
Is it unusual to try somebody like Combs for sex trafficking? Because when I mentioned this, and it was like, I thought sex trafficking is like, you have that shadowy organization that kidnaps young girls from another country, ships them off to, clients, for sex work. That seems to be what people's common definition of sex trafficking is. To charge an individual like him with sex trafficking, is it unusual?
Look, that is what people think about when they think of sex trafficking, but the federal statute is much broader than shadowy organizations, cartels transporting girls across state lines for prostitution. This type of charge, is it unusual? Sure, it's a little unusual, but it fits squarely within the sex trafficking language in the statute.
By the way, not a shocker here, but one of the reasons I love bringing you these stories and talking about all these legal issues is because I love the law. I think it's so important. I think it's fascinating. And when I think about that, how could I not call out experts in the law, litigation more specifically, our great partner and sponsor, Morgan & Morgan. This is America's largest injury law firm. And honestly, what a track record. In the past few months, Morgan & Morgan secured a $9.3 million verdict for a car crash victim in Florida, a $5.6 million verdict for another car accident victim in Atlanta, and not to mention $1.8 million in Kentucky after insurance offered them just $5,000 in that case. And even if you think your case isn't worth millions of dollars, why not start a claim and fight for what you deserve? Morgan & Morgan makes it so simple. You can start a claim from your phone in just 8 clicks. Everything from signing contracts, to uploading documents, to talking to your whole legal team, it can all be done through the phone. So if you're injured, you can easily start a claim at forthepeople.com/LC Sidebar. And it's not that he just allegedly exploited, for example, Cassie Ventura for sex. It's alleging that he did so knowing or in reckless disregard of the fact that force, threats of force, fraud, coercion would be used to make her comply. And the prosecution argues that Combs didn't act alone, right? That he aided, abetted, directed others in carrying out this conduct. And that's the significance of the aiding and abetting language, right, in the charge. Am I understanding that correctly?
You are, although I think from the testimony thus far, it's clear that he is the main player in the sex trafficking charge rather than aiding and abetting somebody else. And
it's not just Ventura, right? So he's also accused of sex trafficking another alleged victim. That's victim 2. We believe this is the person going by the name Jane that was referred to in opening statements at the beginning of this trial. We have yet to hear from Jane at the time of this recording. Maybe she'll testify this week. We're going to get more into what we know about her a little bit later, but I want to take a closer look at the key elements of this charge, sex trafficking: force, fraud, coercion. So these are defined under the United States Code, Title 18, Section 1591, and each plays a critical role in how the government is building a sex trafficking case against Sean Combs. So force typically involves physical threats, violence such as beatings, assaults, the threat of harm to make somebody comply. Fraud can include deceptive promises, for example, a false job offer, lying about the nature of work, the situation the person is being brought into. Coercion, broader, includes threats of serious harm, whether physical, financial, reputational. It can also involve psychological manipulation, abuse of legal power, even the exploitation of a person's maybe drug dependency to control their behavior. I think these are fair arguments to make. But to prove this charge under federal law, the government has to show beyond a reasonable doubt that Sean Combs knowingly engaged in one or more prohibited acts, like recruiting, harboring, transporting someone, and that he knew or recklessly disregarded that force, fraud, or coercion would be used to compel that person to engage in a commercial sex act. Nadia, I want to ask you this question. This is another central question. What separates somebody from being an abusive, manipulative boyfriend who maybe brings a girlfriend on a trip, promises her things, buys her things, has sexual relations with her, versus a sex trafficker, right? Because that's what the defense would be saying. This is a toxic relationship, but he's not a sex trafficker. What's the line there?
Look, it's a good question, and it's a difficult line, but I think here the prosecution is focused on really the coercion aspect, which is threats of serious harm or making someone believe that if they don't engage in the act, that serious harm will result. That is going to be a combination of things. So here there's the physical abuse, there's the threats to release videos of the sexual activity if she doesn't acquiesce to it. There's that reputational harm. There's also been evidence of the control, just general control he had over every aspect of her life, including financial. So it's really putting all of that together. But you're right in that the defense will argue he's just a bad boyfriend and she's trying to please him, and so that's why she agreed to do it.
Because he's not the only high-profile defendant recently who's been charged with something like this. I don't know if you've been following the Alexander brothers, these 3 brothers who are in the real estate and private security business, and the argument there from the defense is, look, these were relationships they had, these were maybe one-night stands that they had, but you're transforming private sexual conduct, maybe even alleged crimes at a state level, into a federal sex trafficking count, and that's where the criticism comes, that's where the questions come. I guess the difference is also this harboring, this maintaining, this transporting. Does it have to be, for here in this example, that he kept bringing her to different locations to have these freak-offs? What do we mean by transporting? What do we mean by harboring? What do we mean by maintaining someone?
Yeah, look, I mean, that part of the statute is not difficult to prove. It can be transporting the escorts, ensuring they come, calling them, asking them to come, moving her around for these purposes as well. That's really not kind of the crux of the statute. The prosecution can establish that pretty easily.
Okay.
The real part is the threats of force, is the threats, the coercion. That is the difficult challenge, and that's the fine line that defense will have one argument, prosecution will have another.
Let's talk about it. I want to break it down. So I'm going to begin with Cassie Ventura's testimony. It spanned 3 days. She described meeting Combs at age 19, 17-year age difference, and we already knew that, and she already described it, that he was this powerful figure in the music industry, telling the jury, quote, ultimately at that point, Sean controlled a lot of my life, whether it was career, the way I dressed, like everything, and I just didn't feel like I had much say in it at that time, being like really super young, naive, total people pleaser. And she painted a picture of a relationship where Combs allegedly exerted control over nearly every aspect of her life, like Nadia was saying, including her finances, her housing, even her personal possessions, saying, if you're not doing what I'm asking of you, or if you're out of line in any way, I'll get my car taken away. Like I got kicked out of the house, my apartment, I would have jewelry taken away. It was very random depending on how he felt. And despite apparently signing a 10-album deal with Bad Boy Records, Cassie testified that her music was shelved. Her career stalled. But at the same time, her involvement in Combs' private life, that apparently escalated, and particularly in what she called, as I mentioned before, freak-offs, these group sexual encounters that over time became what she described as a job, a non-consensual job, according to her, telling the court, eventually it became a job for me, pretty much to where I knew if that is something that he wanted to do, I had the contacts to set it up and get a hotel room and all of that. But in the beginning, Sean set it up, he was in charge. And that while she had initially agreed to participate, according to her, she later changed her mind. Court transcript from her testimony reads, quote, question, how, if at all, did your willingness to engage in freak-offs with Sean change over time? I knew that it wasn't something that I wanted to be doing, especially as regularly as it became. But again, I was just in love and wanted to make him happy. So, Nadia, from a prosecutorial standpoint, does this establish a control element that's necessary in force, fraud, or coercion?
I think the rest of her testimony helps establish that. So initially it's consensual, it sounds like, and then her views about it change. And I believe the questioning continued to bring out that her views kind of coincided with the change in when he started to be violent with her, when he started to control all aspects of her life, when she felt like she couldn't really say no, and that she had no other option. Otherwise, serious harm, physical abuse, reputational abuse, financial harm would result. And they laid a lot of that groundwork through her testimony, which is what you would expect in a case like that.
But you've heard something similar, where it might not just be someone who's chained up in a basement and then forced to have sexual relations with people for money. You've heard similar cases like this, maybe successful prosecutions, where there is that power dynamic?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the Keith Raniere Nexium trial, sex trafficking was charged, and nobody was chained in basements for that case either.
Does it complicate the case that she described having this 11-year relationship with him? There was evidence put forward on cross-examination that she set up the freak-offs, encouraged the freak-offs, but yet she says, this wasn't how I was truly feeling, and that I hadn't agreed to a lot of this. And she described in graphic detail what she claims happened to her. And you wonder if the jury will say, I mean, how could someone actually consent to everything that she described? But on the other hand, people might look at it and say, did she vocalize it? Was it clear that she didn't want it? And on the other hand, I keep going back and forth. There was testimony from Dr. Dawn Hughes, a forensic psychologist, who said, sometimes it takes a while for victims to understand what happened to them. They have to relive traumatic memories. It might take therapy for them to realize it. There's a lot of reasons why people don't leave their abusers. How should we be thinking about it?
Yeah, look, I think is it complicated? Sure. And does the defense have some testimony from Cassie to work with in their closing arguments? Absolutely. And that's why the prosecution brings in an expert witness to help explain it, brings in all these other witnesses to corroborate like the continuous nature of the physical abuse and the control he had over her life. to explain that to the jury. So it's not just coming from Cassie.
By the way, I'm going to get your opinion at the very end about whether or not the prosecution has proved sex trafficking, but there's a lot more elements here. There's a lot more layers. I want to discuss what I actually think is probably the most straightforward path to actually convict him on sex trafficking. But before I do that, I've got a little context here, because she had testified that Combs had recorded many of these encounters. And there was a line of questioning that reads, "Who, if anyone, proposed recording freak-offs?" She responded, "I wouldn't say there was a proposal, it just started happening. Sean brought out a camera, set it up, that's what was happening. Did you want to be recorded? No. I remember feeling insane at first, and then he explained to me that it's for him for afterwards, so yeah." Now, over time, she said that those recordings turned into a method of blackmail. She testified, quote, "Over time, it turned into the fact that there were actual blackmail materials to basically make me feel like if I didn't do it, that it would be hung over my head in that way, or that these things would become public." Now, I said, what's the most straightforward path to sex trafficking? In my opinion, I've said this before, I'll say it again, it's the plane incident, right? So she testified that she was on this plane with Sean Combs. He sits next to her, and he allegedly shows her freak-off videos that he recorded of her, threatens to release the videos to embarrass her. They land. He wants a freak-off. He gets a freak-off. Nadia, travel, threat, coercion, freak-off. Is that not something that the prosecution in a closing argument should hit on every single time to get a conviction on sex trafficking? Am I wrong about that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. It is a powerful vignette from her testimony, and I think is something the prosecution will use, among other things, to prove the sex trafficking.
Because they kept saying, well, when did this happen? It was after a dinner. How soon after was the dinner? 1 or 2 hours? The temporal time, right, between seeing the videos, the plane, and the freak-off is key, right?
Yeah, and you know, an explicit threat like that to release the videos, I mean, that's clearly fits into the definition of coercion and serious harm.
I also think there's another episode that might also be a clear-cut case of sex trafficking, but I'll get to that in a second. I want to also talk about this, because what happened during these sex acts? Well, one of the things that Cassie alleges is that Combs orchestrated these drug-fueled sexual encounters with male escorts that she participated in, what she claims, under duress. And during these, she claims she was high, that Combs supplied her drugs. The questioning from court reads, how long were you awake during the freak-off? Answer, the whole time. Did you want to sleep? Yes. How did you stay awake that whole time? The drugs honestly helped. Who gave the ecstasy? Sean. Who gave you the Molly? Sean. Who gave you the cocaine? Sean. Now, here's the thing. If there was a situation, classic example, young girls being drugged without their consent, didn't know what they were given, and then forced into sex work, you could see, you know, on paper how that's a more easy path towards sex trafficking. It does get a little confusing, I wonder, for the jury. Yes, he supplied the drugs. Did you know you were being given them? Did you have a drug dependency? Did you take them voluntarily? Did you know exactly what you were being given? You think the drugging aspect is a benefit for the prosecution's case or a complicating factor?
Well, I think the drug aspect it could be more relevant to the racketeering charge, because there's the drug trafficking, which essentially is just giving drugs to other people aspect to that charge. So it's part of the story, obviously, of what happens. And so she's going to truthfully say kind of what was involved. But it may also fit in to the racketeering more than the sex trafficking, just the way it came out.
But I get, you know, their big theme here is also like the drugs kept you compliant, right? The drugs kept you compliant. And so it's not one thing. I guess the jury, they're going to say, take it all. The power, the violence, the drugs, it all goes into it together. But the defense will say she knew what she was happening, willing participant. That
will be their argument for sure.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, what the prosecution will harp on is that this isn't just a one-off event where they're experimenting, having fun, doing a threesome or whatever. This was continuous. I think she testified it became like a literal job for her, where most of her week is engaging in these freak-offs or preparing to engage in the freak-offs and recovering from them. And so I think that's also, you know, you asked me earlier, what's the line here between state law or just a bad boyfriend and a federal crime? I think this is not that close to the line, given like the extended and continuous nature of the conduct.
I think the more they emphasize how prolonged it was, how extensive it was, how, I'm sorry to say, disgusting it was. I don't even want to repeat some of the things that she said. The jury might be left with how on earth can someone actually consent to that, but the defense says, look, she wanted to please him, and not as a form of control, but because she was in love with him, right? Love, jealousy. So now I want to turn to another, what I believe could be a clear-cut path conviction for sex trafficking. Obviously, innocent until proven guilty. They have a defense. But the same way I say the plane incident is maybe the most easily digestible way to get to sex trafficking, now we got to talk about March 2016. So the infamous incident caught on surveillance, March of 2016, where Diddy can allegedly be seen physically assaulting Cassie in the Intercontinental Hotel in Los Angeles. And we're not going to show you the video here because obviously it's just disturbing to say the least. But when you put something on YouTube, obviously, there's certain content guidelines about what we can show. But Cassie testified that things became incredibly violent during a freak-off in the hotel room with Combs hitting her. And according to her testimony, it was when she tried to leave that freak-off that the hotel surveillance captured this alleged assault by Combs. She testified, quote, "After he hit me, and I saw the result of it, I knew I had to get out. So when he was distracted, I don't know exactly what he was doing. He was either in the shower or on the phone. I just grabbed my stuff and ran out as fast as I could." So if the jury accepts this, if they accept that there was violence during this freak-off, that there was an escort there, that she was packing up her things, trying to leave or escape the freak-off, he comes out, assaults her, drags her, does that have all the elements of sex trafficking?
Yeah, I mean, that's using force to get someone to continue engaging in the Commercial Sex Act. And then that also is evidence for kind of all the other freak-offs that happen after that, right? That episode is presumably in her mind. She knows what can happen if she says no. And that's the argument I expect the prosecution to make.
Real quick about this, I was having a conversation with my colleague Chris Stewart about it, and he's going to be doing extensive videos also on the firebombing episode as well. But one of the things we were talking about is, can the prosecution or the defense argue in any way why Combs wasn't brought up on state charges, right? Why wasn't he brought up on state charges, arson, one other thing. Why wasn't he brought up on state charges for, I don't know if it's assault or battery in California, there's a statute of limitations issue, but could you say, hey, if you're the defense, if he really did do this, why wasn't he arrested and prosecuted by LA authorities? Can you bring that up in a federal case like this or no?
Well, I don't think you can bring it up like as explicitly as you just said, but they have kind of done it through their questioning, which is asking various people who witnessed physical assaults of Cassie, like, did you call the police? Why didn't you call the police? And the suggestion there, and they've said explicitly in their opening argument, and I expect them to harp on this in their closing, he's guilty of domestic violence. He's not guilty of these federal charges. So they've been pretty explicit about that. And I assume they've done that because you really can't get away from the video.
One of the things I struggled with were trying to see if the freak-offs equate to sex trafficking is they called Sheree Hayes, he's known as the Punisher. This is a former male performer who was hired allegedly to have sex with Cassie. And one of the things he said is from what he observed, everything seemed consensual. I was curious why the prosecution even called him other than establish, hey, freak-offs happen. This is another witness to testify other than Cassie, and these freak-offs happened. I feel like that testimony might hurt the prosecution if you're trying to prove sex trafficking.
Well, as a prosecutor, you want to present your entire case and not leave something for the defense to then bring out that you didn't. So if they hadn't brought that out in the direct examination, or if they hadn't called that witness, you can expect that the defense would have called them. And then it looks, frankly, worse for the prosecution.
I think it wasn't just Cassie's testimony that might have helped prove sex trafficking at this point. And again, I'm going to get your conclusion at the end, but there were other witnesses who described various instances of alleged threats, intimidation, control. And when you wonder if this helps the prosecution's sex trafficking case, for example, you got rapper Kid Cudi. Testified that Combs broke into his home, set his car on fire after discovering he had been dating Cassie, despite the fact that apparently she and Combs were on a break at the time. Dawn Richard from Danity Kane testified that Combs punched Cassie in front of high-profile celebrities like Usher, Neo, Jimmy Iovine, which, my opinion, if true, goes to the idea that no one steps in to protect her, the power of Sean Combs. Why didn't Cassie leave? Something to be thinking about. Could she actually leave? Who would believe her? Would she have the power to leave? Cassie's mother testified that she paid $20,000 to Combs after he allegedly threatened to release sexually explicit videos of Cassie, wanted to be reimbursed for the money that he spent on her in their relationship because she was now with someone else. George Kaplan, former assistant of Combs, testified seeing Combs allegedly physically attack Cassie on a private jet, but said again, neither he nor anyone else intervened. Kerry Morgan told the jury that Combs would call her as many as 50 times in a row, trying to track Cassie's whereabouts. This helps sex trafficking, all this?
Yeah, it shows the control he had over her life. It also explains how it continued for so long, even in front of other people. Nobody calling the police. I mean, these people like Sean Combs, it's not unusual. Celebrities like that have a lot of power, a lot of stature, that people don't act as they would in front of regular people. Most of us, I think, would think they would call the police if they saw a physical assault like that happen. But situations like this with celebrities are a bit different.
Yeah, again, it goes to the idea of why didn't she leave? Why didn't she report him? Why didn't she say something? Why didn't she fight back harder? I think all of this is important. The power dynamic is really something the prosecution is going to hone in on. Okay, before I ask about victim 2, okay, at this point in the case, do you think the prosecution has proven sex trafficking, at least with respect to Cassie Ventura?
I think they're a long way towards that. I think Cassie's testimony is the bulk of the case for sex trafficking for one of the counts, and everything else is being put on to support her testimony. And they've done a good job, I think, establishing that certainly physical abuse was part of a regular part of the dynamic between the two of them. The reputational harm from threatening to release the videos, they've gotten that from Cassie herself, but also her mother's testimony. And so I think they're well on their way.
What's missing?
Well, I think, this is a long trial. They've estimated the prosecution's case will be 6 weeks. And in cases like this, the evidence comes in bits and pieces. And so we've got another sex trafficking alleged victim that will testify. That will also bolster, I think, the case for Cassie's charge. And so, nothing's ever proven beyond a reasonable doubt until the very end. But
it's a good prosecutor answer. It's a very good prosecutor answer. But no, look, I mean, in a racketeering case, in a sex trafficking case, pattern matters. The pattern, multiple victims matters. So let's talk real quick about alleged victim number 2. Haven't heard from yet in court. I believe this is the person referred to as Jane during the opening statement. So, for example, the prosecution alleged in their opening, quote, the defendant instructed her to put on an outfit and call up an escort for a freak off. He made Jane cover her black eye and bruising, take an ecstasy pill, and perform for the defendant with that escort. Like with Cassie, the defendant's violence had gotten him what he wanted. Now, importantly, these alleged acts took place much more recently, so between 2021 and 2024. That matters, right? That time period matters. When we talk about what we can anticipate with Jane Doe, or Jane's testimony, or alleged victim number 2's testimony, what are you going to be looking out for?
Well, we'll be looking out for, kind of the same dynamic, the physical abuse, and how that affected her decision making. Did she feel coerced? And it sounds from the openings like maybe there was potentially a time where she was okay with trying this out, and then over time that changed.
What makes more sense to a jury? That Combs engaged in a repeated pattern of abuse of women, sex trafficking of women, or the defense saying each one of these people is not telling the truth and each one of these people is cooperating with the government for maybe financial reasons, maybe personal reasons. The government has overextended itself in this sex trafficking case. Which would make more sense, you think, for the jury?
It's easier to convince a jury that one person is lying than that multiple people are lying, and especially multiple people who don't know each other, who haven't interacted with each other. So as they start to hear similar stories about his conduct and his behavior over and over, the defense will make that argument, but I think it's harder for a jury to wrap their head around literally everyone in a trial being a liar.
All right, well, we still have more of a trial. I think this is a really, really interesting analysis of what is a very important charge, 2 charges that Sean Combs is facing. And by the way, sex trafficking is also one of the underlying crimes for racketeering. So when we talk about racketeering, right, they have to prove at least 2 predicate crimes: sex trafficking, kidnapping, arson, bribery. Sex trafficking, they're really putting a lot of evidence and a lot of their narrative into the sex trafficking case. So we shall see. Nadia Shihata, thank you so much. Such a pleasure.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.